Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Bernico.
This week on the show, we're taking a break from the Book of Revelation to talk about a more contemporary apocalypse, the U.S.'s actions on Cuba. I feel like Cuba is a country that a lot of people obviously know a thing or two about, but is actually really hard to know a lot about, and is more interesting the more you kind of peel back the layers of what's going on. And whenever there's a huge global event like this, that kind of like forces people to, I guess, think about it or not think about it. And here we are. We're going to think about it for the next hour or so together. And Matt and I have had a long history of kind of looking at Christianity and the left and how it relates to Cuba. So we're going to try to unpack that a little bit in this episode and figure out, I guess, a good Christian lefty take on how to have solidarity with Cuba in this specific kind of moment. Before we get to that, though, Matt, I don't know, anything particularly apocalyptic going on in your life over there? I feel like this is going to be the new Magnificast icebreaker question. The new kind of segment is what's your personal apocalypse going on this week?
No, in fact, nothing apocalyptic happening. I'm just sort of living my life as a normal person, watching other worlds end around me just from TV and online. So that's awful. I keep finding myself, so I don't watch TV. Sorry, that's not a brag. That's just like a fact about my life. I don't really ever watch TV.
Real Marshall McLuhan over here.
Yeah, I'm not doing that. But I do go to the gym, and when I go to the gym, the TV is always on and the news is always on. And it's such a weird thing to be getting those big gains and doing 1,000 reps and coming very strong while you do watch like clips of, I don't know, Nicolas Maduro getting kidnapped. That's where I first saw it. Or, whatever, the United States starving Cuba of oil and energy, and therefore, collectively punishing the entire society for no really very good reason. Very strange. So, whatever. Living through the apocalypse is one thing, but also watching the apocalypse happen to somebody else on TV is especially bad. Something deeply awful about that.
Yeah, that's right. We're going to have to find the chapter of Revelation where that happens, where somebody is like doing fine, but they know that I don't know, half the world is covered in blood or something.
Wow, just over the fence, just on the other side of that grassy lot over there, there's 12,000 white-robed martyrs. I wonder what those guys are up to. Probably fine. Probably nothing to worry about.
Watching that at the gym. That's the scene they didn't do in Left Behind, when Kirk Cameron is just at the gym, kind of seeing CNN headlines about absurd supernatural phenomena.
Okay, that is true, but I think that this is my vague and foggy recollection from being a teen reading Left Behind. I believe that the scene when there are the two guys in Israel who are like spitting fire out of their mouths, I do believe that is on TV. I'm like 90% sure that's sort of like a scene where it's happening on television for Buck Rogers or whatever his name is, Buck Williams. Sorry. Anyways, so the apocalypse will be televised, absolutely. The revolution, not so much, but the apocalypse is definitely on TV.
That's true. And the more you say that, the more it's all coming back to me, because he is also a reporter and a journalist. So
that's right.
I guess in my brain, I didn't allow myself to think evangelicals were so crazy, but here we are.
Imagine going to Israel while these two guys are spitting fire and you're like, who, what, when, where, why about this one? Why are they doing this? That's how Buck Williams talks. He has a transatlantic accent, in case you didn't know.
I think that's right. Yeah, well, I mean, it's similar over here. I do have one small apocalypse, which is that I keep seeing these ants in my apartment, and I just moved apartments, and I was pretty sure that I saw an ant at the beginning of when we moved in. And I had a previous ant problem in a different apartment a long time ago, and I feel like it has left me, traumatized by ants. And I feel like, so far, things are fine. They're not taking over. We're being proactive about it. But I am, finding myself getting the heebie-jeebies, being like, oh no, our personal ant-apocalypse in deep winter is about to happen. So just really praying that doesn't happen, that the whatever bowl needs to be poured out or not poured out or seal needs to remain sealed. Don't blow any trumpets. Just keep all the ants wherever they're supposed to be right now. I don't want any more of them. That's my personal apocalyptic prayer right now. Keep the seals bound on the ants.
Roll that seal right up. Do not let the plague of ants into your house. That sounds great. I hope they don't get in there. That's the worst.
It is the worst. I love that these little guys are socialists, but I want them to be socialists somewhere else.
Right. Well,
Um,
if only your apartment wasn't the imperialist front line.
that's right. Okay, speaking of the imperialist front line, let's talk about Cuba. If you have not been watching the news or you're listening to this in the future or I don't know what, the headlines are this. Donald Trump, he's still bad. He managed to discipline the country of Venezuela, kidnap their president, and is now in an extremely weird and complicated relationship with that country, trying to manage it, while that country is also not being directly managed by the United States, and a kind of weird, I don't know, diplomatic dance of just a game of chicken. I don't know what metaphor to use, but it's a complex situation. That happened earlier this year in 2026. And then in the last month, there has been a kind of ongoing development where Trump is tightening the screws on Cuba, Venezuela's ally, in part by controlling that relationship, stopping fuel shipments from going to Cuba from Venezuela, and then also stopping fuel shipments from Iran and Russia and other allies. And most recently, Trump signed an executive order threatening tariffs on any country at all that sends oil to Cuba, whether by trade or in terms of humanitarian aid. And I gotta tell you, it is not good. It's very bad. It is an incredibly dangerous policy situation. And so far, the world community is, I will not say powerless to stop it, but without the will to stop it, as we've seen that story happen in so many other cases in global politics. So we're recording this in the middle of February, so it's a live ongoing situation, but nevertheless, an important moment to kind of stop and take stock of what's going on in this particular apocalyptic moment. What is it revealing about the United States? What's it revealing about Cuba, about kind of the Christian commitment in a time like this? And I guess that's what we're going to parse out here. Matt, I don't know, where should we start in this extremely complicated story?
Right. So you're not wrong in saying that the world governments are not powerless. They could stop that in some way or another. I don't know. I'm not a politician. That's not my job to figure out. But because of the particular political economy of energy and oil in the world, the U.S. does make that particularly hard, threatening tariffs on everyone. You know, if they interfere, that's a particular type of bad. I keep thinking of this situation and trying to think like, how is it that we've gotten here? And I just keep thinking of that meme, you know, of the guy pushing over the very small domino and then the very big domino falls.
Right.
And like the very big domino in this case is like Donald Trump threatening tariffs to anyone who sends oil to Cuba. And like the very small the very small domino, I guess, is the US kidnaps Maduro. That's the first thing that happens, right? So that happened. The United States kidnaps Nicolas Maduro, and then we talked about that previously on the podcast, and you know, a lot of people posited that it was primarily about oil, and I think that there is some truth to it being about oil, but there's probably also some truth to it just being about vibes as well. That was the thesis statement of a few episodes ago, so you can go back and listen to that if you wanted to. But since that happened, Venezuelan oil has stopped going to Cuba because, I mean, you can guess why, but it started going other places like Israel, which is very suspicious and weird and interesting in the bad way. And that has led to now new sanctions on oil going to Cuba. So that means that the main suppliers of Cuba's oil, Venezuela and Mexico, can no longer send them oil. And the last domino is that this is very bad and catastrophic. I mean, I don't know what will actually happen in the end with this whole situation. I'm sure something bad, but it's awful. The whole set of dominoes from beginning to end are all terrible. And man, they could just choose not to do any of this, right? And like the world would be a better place. But you know, the people in power over there in the United States are not interested in the world being a better place. So I guess here we are.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, you know, something we can contribute to this is probably if you're listening to this podcast, you already know this is bad. We don't have to tell you that, but sometimes it's good to just say it. But I think one thing that we can figure out together is kind of what are the, I guess, deeper kind of things at work that have created a situation where, you know, Cuba can't just receive oil or fuel from abroad, and why would kind of cutting off the Venezuela relationship in particular be strategically advantageous for the U.S. government. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that kind of like history of Cuba's economic situation and energy strategy, which is actually really interesting and something that Matt and I were kind of reading and researching when we were working on the degrowth book. So we can go back to some of that material. But then there's also kind of an interesting story to tell, I guess, about how this move factors into the kind of like imperial appetite of the Trump administration right now. So we can talk a bit about that. And then maybe at the end, we'll turn a little bit to how Christians in Cuba are engaging on that island. I've been in touch with some folks there, and interesting to learn more about that. So we can kind of land the plane, I guess, figuring out the Christian side. But we can maybe just we can give ourselves permission to kind of get into the weeds of Cuba's weird political, economic, and energy situation, because I think those are actually like details that are really interesting to learn about. And the more you know about that, the more, I guess, the easier it is to then kind of find yourself in that story, because Cuba is extremely complex. So the more you make it legible, the easier it is to be like, okay, I can act confidently in this complicated situation.
Yeah. That all sounds good. Well, okay, let's talk a little bit about energy in Cuba, and then we can kind of figure out, why exactly Venezuela is so important, and where we got to, or where that gets us to right now. There's a very cool book that I would like to pitch on this podcast called The Low Carbon Contradiction by Gustav Siederloff, which is an awesome name and one that's very fun to say. Gustav Siederloff. I'm saying it all the time. Anyways, it's a neat book that's about the ways that like the comparing life expectancy and the quality of life between Cuba and the United States is interesting, because life expectancy is a bit higher in Cuba than it is in the United States. Something that you might not expect from a country that is as impoverished as it is. But that's because the particular framework of socialism has given a high level of well-being to a lot of people. So the question that is interesting to Gustav Siederloff in this book is like, how is a country able to do so much with so little, which is quite an interesting idea, especially for people who are interested in degrowth. Not necessarily saying that Cuba is like a degrowth economy, because that's not true. They have a very complicated relationship with growth, which is, I don't know, fine. But it's an interesting thing to kind of take a look at, if that's an economic kind of paradigm that you're invested in or you're interested in. How can a country do more with less? Always great to look at. So this book kind of lays out a little bit of a timeline of the energy system within Cuba, how it's developed after the revolution, and like kind of what comes of that. And we don't need to go into it in great detail because we don't have time for that kind of thing. But let me tell you a few things about how energy in Cuba works in the big socialist society that we know and love.
By the way, real quick, this sounds like something that a huge nerd would tell you in the lunchroom cafeteria or something. But I'm here to tell you this is actually what a cool jock would tell you in the lunchroom cafeteria. So just kind of get that in your brain. Imagine some huge, great energy jock here sitting you down to be like, listen up, kids, this is where the cool kids actually sit. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Really important that you don't tune out to this extremely important information on energy policy in a country that none of us live in.
I was just talking earlier about how I've just been going to the gym so much. So this is really energy jock territory. I just want to let everybody know that I've had 145 grams of protein today, and I'm ready to tell you about how Cuba works with regard to energy. And I'm doing it in the most swole and jacked way possible. So get ready, nerds, or I'm gonna give you a wedgie. All right,
jacking in with this jock. I don't know. That sounds maybe not quite right. We'll find it later.
We'll workshop some ideas here. Okay, so the Cuban Revolution happens. We know it. We love it. Fidel does it. All of your favorites are there. Che Guevara, all of the rest. It's great. So some of it's, you know it, you love it. It's great. So after the revolution happens, it takes a minute for sort of full communism to kick in. But some of the first forays into that territory are things like agricultural reform, which is a big one. We've talked about this on the podcast a long time ago. You can Google Cuban agricultural reform and learn more about it. But after that, Fidel decided, Fidel and the other communists, it's not just Fidel. He's never the only guy in charge, but he is the coolest guy in charge. The best baseball player in charge, that's for sure. Anyways, Fidel creates what's called the SEN, or in English, it's the National Electrical System, which creates a socialist energy infrastructure in Cuba that brings electricity to the people of Cuba, and it sort of evens out the levels of, I guess, well-being in Cuba between people. So rather than just only people in the cities or in the sort of affluent areas having access to electricity, the whole country is electrified more or less. And, equality is brought via electricity because people can do all kinds of great things with electricity, like read in the dark or have particular modes of sanitation or, all kinds of things that you need electricity for. Not only that, but it brings all kinds of mechanization to Cuba in terms of like big farms and stuff. So production is able to be amplified because of electricity. People get all kinds of good things that they need because of it. Isn't that great? And that's awesome for a little bit. Some of the state, like the electrical generation plants. Oh my God, I'm not sounding like a nerd that knows a lot about electricity when I say it like that. The plants generating electricity in Cuba, they're running off of the oil that is shipped to them from USSR in terms of a like sort of fair trade deal between the two socialist nations, and that's awesome.
Okay, really quick, a pause on that because it is so interesting. The trade that happens between Cuba and the Soviet Union, we all know how money works, right? An incredibly simple thing. That's a joke. It's not simple at all. Money is a very weird kind of abstract representation of labor or value or capital, depending on how you're using it. All these kind of things. In capitalism, we do economic exchange in increasingly complicated ways that do not really kind of recognize equal labor, right? That's not really what's going on. A capitalist is appropriating money from workers by kind of stealing their labor power over time. When Cuba and the USSR were trying to figure out how to trade, Cuba, it doesn't have a lot of money, didn't have a lot of money, but what it did have was labor, and it had some commodities, in particular sugar. And they needed a lot of other stuff, a lot of inputs that they couldn't get due to U.S. discipline. And so they have this really wild arrangement where, like, the way that they kind of like drew up the balance sheets to determine trade was done through a kind of like labor equation. So it was more based on equivalence of kind of labor power, which is super fascinating, actually, because there's a lot of debate in the history of socialism around like how to do accounting if you're a socialist instead of a capitalist. Anyway, all, again, extremely nerdy stuff, but there's a really cool explanation of it in John Smith's book called Imperialism that you can read about. And anyway, it's all really neat, but interesting for the energy bit here too, right? Because like Cuba didn't have the money to, I don't know, like, well, and also didn't have the natural resource of like as much oil as something like the Soviet Union. And so they, found a kind of workaround to get that energy input into Cuba. So that's a situation that will change later on in the history of Cuba, which I'm sure you'll talk about in a minute. But just a fun thing to pause and kind of recognize there was like a completely different way of like arranging international relations there.
Yeah, very cool. A good one, a good thing to pull out here in this conversation. Oh, sorry. One note. This is absolutely an aside that's not important in this conversation, but I do want to say it out loud because it's very fun. The power stations in Cuba, when they were built during this time, part of the SEN network, they often had names associated with them from people from the revolution. So, for example, there is a Camilo Cienfuegos power station, which I think is awesome.
Definitely.
Love it. I love naming things after cool people. Very neat. Okay, so we have energy infrastructure that's bringing an electrified socialism to Cuba, and isn't that great? But then tragedy strikes. The USSR falls apart in the early 90s, and that kind of transitions Cuba into what is called the special period. I'll let Dean talk more about the special period in 1 second, but let me just tell you this. Cuba is an island that becomes very beholden and dependent upon the oil from the USSR. So, when that dries up, then things become very difficult. Dean, do you want to say more about the special period and describe it more more dramatically than I have?
Sure. So, yeah, the special period was called that by Fidel. That was his name for it. And as you say, the Soviet Union collapsed. So then that unique arrangement also of kind of getting these inputs on the cheap, or at least through a different accounting method from the USSR, that also changes. There's a lot of literature also that tries to figure out like the right way to describe Cuba's relationship to the Soviet Union. Like some people describe it as a kind of dependency relationship, in, I don't know, some good ways or some bad ways. That all depends. There's like debate on the left about that. I think, I mean, the special period itself proves that Cuba was basically surviving as a result of kind of inputs from the Soviet Union. And once those inputs left, or the subsidies left, that left Cuba kind of out, high and dry. It's kind of like, I mean, this is not a perfect analogy, but if you think about how, like, US aid was just like gutted overnight, and now all these countries are stuck being like, what are we supposed to do without all this money that we had budgeted for, accounted on, and so on? It's kind of like that. Like, all this money and these goods and inputs into Cuba just kind of ended overnight. And people expected that as a result, there would just be like, I don't know, unrest and finally a kind of end of the Cuban system, which would fall just like the Soviet system fell, and that would be the end of communism. And there was some unrest in Cuba for the first time since the revolution, which was quite interesting. But what is so amazing about the special period is that Cuba massively contracted. Like, their economic activity contracted, their electrical consumption contracted, all this stuff. And it was a time of like extreme austerity and intensity, like people not getting the healthcare that they need. People got skinnier, like measurable kind of impacts, like lower caloric intake, all this kind of stuff. But what's really fascinating is like the Cuban political system itself really like activated to make a case for socialism, even in a situation of austerity. So to give you some examples, Fidel went on like a huge speaking tour, and he was trying to like explain what the benefits are of socialism. So he would like on energy, for example, he would get in front of a bunch of people, and something he would often say is like, nobody knows how much it costs to pay for electricity in Cuba. Like citizens don't know that. And why is that? It's because they don't get a bill that itemizes what they pay. The state figures out how to deliver electricity as best they can in an efficient and equitable way. And isn't that good? Isn't that better than being like, well, electricity, you get as much as you can reasonably afford, and, somebody else is making money off of exploiting that situation, all this kind of stuff. So they're really trying to like explain the utility of socialism, but it wasn't only Fidel, and it wasn't only like the political apparatus, which I think is an important part of the story. Like a lot of worker councils and labor unions in Cuba took a lot of time to kind of organize conversations about Cuban socialism. What is it? What do they want out of it, etc. And then this is also a period when churches became more and more important in Cuban society. Fidel actively started working with the Cuban Council of Churches and other Christians to basically recognize that like churches could fill in the gaps in society. And they could also like kind of inculcate like a spirit of solidarity and care and trust between citizens, which the government had sometimes definitely in the past been like, we don't need that from religion and actually don't want it, like actively want to get rid of that. But in the 90s, by necessity, the state and Christians kind of found more opportunities to better understand each other, work together, etc. So you have this kind of flowering also of like progressive Christian organizations on the island. So, they got through the special period into the early 2000s. And I guess, that situation was changed in large part because of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. So I guess I could pass the baton to you in a minute, Matt, because I'm just rambling on about the special period. But I think like what's really fascinating about it is it shows the vulnerability of the Cuban experiment, but it also shows the like resilience of it and the kind of participatory nature of it, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, totally. We can talk about Chavez in 1 second, but before we do, the special period, like you said, it's a huge contraction of electricity and of economic activity and all these other things. But there is a lot of interesting pivoting that happens during the special period with regards to the production of electricity. Cuba finds all kinds of really creative ways to continue sort of like an industrial type of society, despite having less and less oil to actually, use to create electricity. So the Searloff book goes into some detail about the different ways that like farmers, they use this example from two dairy farmers who kind of who use the output of their cattle, the poop, to create like a biodigester where it would create methane, and they would hook that up to the cooktop in their kitchen so that they would use the methane produced by the cows to cook their food, or they would use like a solar heater to boil water that was provided by, I guess, like Chinese aid. They would use that on the farm for like sanitation and interesting things like that. Another important note though is that even though there's like this huge contraction of economic activity, there's still importantly like needs to be a lot of output in terms of agriculture. During the special period, the amount of tractors used shrunk drastically because they don't have the fossil fuels to power the tractors, and instead they reverted back to using oxen to plow fields. I can't remember the exact number, but it's something like the number of tractors shrinks to only a few thousand, whereas the number of oxen grows to be like 100,000 or something, like over 100,000, hundreds of thousands. So anyways, interesting. I mean, I think there's like a real something very cool about that. I mean, the special period is awful. Don't let me like spin it the other any other way. But there's like something cool about the ingenuity of people sort of within a socialist system to think of other ways of meeting the material needs of their society and kind of keep things going, despite the very bad circumstances. So that's cool.
It kind of reminds me of like there's that really famous line from Lenin about how communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the country.
Yeah.
So that's like a really famous, thing that people like to quote and then either criticize or appreciate in Lenin. And you definitely saw that in Cuba in the early days of the revolution, that they're kind of porting that over. And there's some truth to it, right? Because what Lenin was getting at is that you need to really industrialize, like Russia needed to catch up. And to do that, it needed electricity. But then there are also all these equitability kind of concerns, as you mentioned earlier, access to all kinds of stuff that electricity gives you besides just like playing video games, and besides even just turning on the lights, like automated plumbing and all kinds of things like that. So, you see Cuba following a similar model, and it did that quite remarkably, like a huge nation building project to kind of electrify the country. But in the special period, you kind of get like a test of a different sort of definition of communism. It doesn't actually equal the electrification of the country per se. It equals like some other kind of set of values of solidarity, some other kind of like social imaginary or whatever. So, that's also, again, like I think it's important not to romanticize the special period. It was not good. Cubans do not remember it fondly. Nobody has nostalgia for that moment in time. But it's a kind of like, again, by necessity, an interesting like challenge to be like, well, what would socialism be or communism be without this kind of like attachment to a specific kind of modernization? So anyway, that's all very fascinating and something that Cuba is still kind of like dialectically, figuring out back and forth. Like they both do want to restore a reliable electrical grid across the country. And at the same time, they're like forced to figure out how to do that or how to deal with not being able to do that. So quite an interesting social problem.
Yeah, totally. All right, let me power through these last 2 points about electricity in Cuba, and then we can talk more about the situation that exists that sucks. There's the special period. Cuba's struggling, finding all kinds of innovative ways, but probably suboptimal ways of living an industrialized life with an industrialized country, while having less and less access to oil. But then in 1999, something very cool happens in a country called Venezuela, and that is Hugo Chavez becomes president. Everyone loves that. Well, not everyone. Most people don't, in terms of the global north, but for Venezuela and for the global south and for Latin America and the Caribbean, it's very good. So Chavez is the president, and there's much rejoicing. A year later, in the year 2000, Fidel and Chavez, they formalized an agreement between their two countries that integrates the economies of Cuba and Venezuela in a big way. As is pertinent to this conversation, Venezuela starts shipping lots of oil to Cuba. This is very cool because now there is a socialist country in Latin America with vast access to oil and refineries, and it undercuts like the dependency that Latin America and the Caribbean have on oil imports from the United States and from other sort of global north countries. It's a really important thing that happened in the year 2000. So this newfound connection between Venezuela and Cuba sort of restarts the Cuban economy in a lot of ways, right? Things change because of the connection between these two countries. An interesting thing though that happens is, okay, so Cuba's faced all these really big hardships in terms of electricity and power and oil because of political reasons. But then later in the early 2000s, Cuba faces a whole bunch of hardships around the same exact thing. Oil and energy and electricity, all these kinds of things, but not because of global politics, but instead because of hurricanes, because the rise of climate change, because of all of these kind of environmental factors. A number of hurricanes landing on Cuba shores, destroying infrastructure and making life once again very difficult. Just like we saw kind of during the special period, there's a level of ingenuity here that is quite interesting and a level of adaptability. So to combat the ways that electricity keeps kind of getting knocked out because of hurricanes, Cuba like kind of pivots again, and they work at distributing the electrical network across the island. There are a bunch of diesel generators that are connected to the network. So if the power goes out in one spot in one part of the country because of hurricanes, because of all kinds of bad weather events, these other diesel generators will kick on, and they can restore power, or like restore at least some stability to power in the area, which I think is quite interesting. So even after the flow of oil is restored to Cuba, there's still like a lot of of new thinking about energy and electricity in Cuba that is different than the type of thinking that you might get in other countries. So I thought that's all quite interesting. But anyways, this all brings us to today. The U.S. kidnaps Maduro. They reroute Venezuelan oil to, I don't know, Israel and other places, I guess. And this means that while Cuba's energy system is like flexible and dynamic and, like we've seen throughout history, the people of Cuba are in a very bad way without any oil imports from Venezuela or from Mexico. And that sucks. That's so bad. So yeah, that kind of brings us to where we are. The U.S. is threatening tariffs on countries supplying Cuba with oil as a way to, I don't know, either force regime change or just short of that, do something to discipline the entire country. I don't know. There's a lot of ways to think. People have a lot of feelings about Cuba, and I think that the people that listen to this podcast probably have one particular feeling about Cuba, and that's a good one. But if you're ever out in the world talking to people about Cuba and energy, and they maybe have particular feelings about this, you can at least tell them that punishing an entire population for basically no reason is bad, no matter what, and that's what this is. So I think that sucks. I think that sucks, Dean. What's going on kind of in the Christian solidarity world with regard to Cuba and electricity?
Yeah, I mean, I've been kind of chatting with friends that I've made there over visiting Cuba for the last few years, and just kind of keeping in touch and hearing, how the churches are responding. And, I think that it is an extremely dire and complex moment, right? Like, public transit is not running in a place like Havana. Most people don't have cars, so that severely limits your ability to move and get around, and you're pretty limited to like your physical means to get yourself somewhere. And that also has downstream problems in terms of people with vulnerabilities, or folks who have mobility challenges already. So that is a huge problem. There's also increasingly unstable electrical grid. That has been true for the last few years, and depending on where you were in the island, you would have experienced it more or less. So, for example, like even when I went in 2024, like in Havana, it would have been pretty rare to have a blackout in the capital. But if you were in a kind of outlying region, especially a rural region, but even like a smaller city, you might experience that more. So we went to a place called Cardenas, which is a smaller city, and experienced a couple of blackouts there. And, that was a couple of years ago. So now that there's even less oil coming in, zero effectively oil coming in, those blackouts have also reached Havana, and there's really no part of the country that is, like insulated, I guess, from the kind of shortages of what's going on, except for maybe like certain resort areas or like tourist areas, which is also a very complex conversation. Like average people will sometimes be like, tourists shouldn't go to Cuba because then they're enjoying this country while everybody who actually lives there suffers. There is definitely like a kind of bad look, I guess, to be like, tourists are out there like at their all inclusive, kind of like eating whatever they want and like going on Wi-Fi and I don't know, watching YouTube or something, and like, not that far away, Cubans are kind of rationing their goods, and like that inequality, that global inequality, is really felt in the tourism industry. Although that's not that different than tourism anywhere else, right? Like the Dominican Republic or Mexico or whatever. I guess it's, it feels weird in Cuba because it's a country that is about trying to build a more equitable society. So there's kind of a like, maybe people hold it to an ethical standard. Or anyway, I'm rambling a bit here, but all that to say, like, the tourism industry is still nevertheless extremely important for Cuba. It's their only way, really, or their primary way of accessing foreign currency because of the U.S. blockade. And so, they have this really weird situation where, like, Cubans are faced with extreme austerity, and even the means by which they are trying to get money, which depend on kind of routing certain resources to resort areas, even that is now drying up. So you've seen like airlines, especially like every Canadian airline, suspended service to Cuba. So all that money is just not coming into the country at all. So, it is like extreme political and economic asphyxiation. And the kind of Christian response from what I've been seeing is to really double down on mutual aid and kind of preserving like a certain feeling of kind of true hope and faith. So, for example, like the student Christian movement on the island has been trying to like gather goods and distribute them to people who need them, and really like try to help out where they can in terms of, folks who have mobility issues or things like that. Like they're making a huge effort to just make sure people kind of get what they need. There's also places like the Martin Luther King Center, which are still doing like really important political education, like trying to explain like to Cubans and to the rest of the world why exactly things are the way that they are, and create some conversation around that, and like call out the blockade as being a pretty massive unique pressure against Cuba. And I think also Christian spaces in Cuba are a space where Cubans are allowed to just explore, the future that they want for their country. My own experience in Cuba is that, like, contrary to both like leftist idealizations of Cuba and like right-wing fantasies about Cuba, it's not the case that like Cubans are either like they all have the same opinion about the government, which is that it's good. That's like the left-wing idealization, I guess, or that like nobody is allowed to talk about politics because of the like repressive communist regime, which is bad, and that's the right-wing fantasy. Like, neither of those things I think are true. My experience is that Cubans, like in every single country in the world, have a profoundly complicated way of talking about their own situation, and nuances, and politicians they like and politicians they don't like, and all that kind of stuff. So I think Christians are actually preserving a space for like genuine dialogue in a time of extreme austerity. And that's a really unique kind of role to play in a place like Cuba. So it's reminiscent of the special period, but it's actually in some ways even more intense, because the collapse in the special period was like, well, the Soviet Union quit. And so does that mean communism is over? And they decided, no, like we could get through it in our own way. This new period is actually an even more direct imposition of imperialism, to be like, imperialism is the primary driver of this specific moment of austerity, which is unnecessary. And I actually am curious myself to see like whether or not the population will double down on its feeling of resistance and resentment toward that, or, like whether or not that will provoke, I don't know, impatience. That would be a reasonable feeling to have, I guess, if you're kind of stuck in extreme austerity. So yeah, it's a wildly complicated situation, but it's cool to see that Christians on the island are like, I guess, taking that on board in a Christian way. What does it mean to be like a loving, caring, neighborly person in a time of austerity, regardless of what's going on?
Yeah, that is very cool to hear. I mean, if anything, Christians should be good at that kind of stuff. And at least it's good to see that the student Christian movement is bringing that energy to Cuba. That's very good. I like that a lot. Dean, maybe we can talk for a minute about the big picture political implications, or like what's going on at the highest levels, because it just seems like, I mean, looking at it from afar as I am, it's so hard to figure out what exactly the United States wants from this particular situation. Like why? Why do this? Because it is the case that Cuba does not have oil, as we've been talking about, and they're reliant on imports, right? So it's not like there's a political economic reason to control Cuba like there is in Venezuela, for example. To me, I guess it just feels like this is so much more of a symbolic domination than anything, I guess, to previously meddle in Venezuela and now doing this to Cuba. It does seem like a way to, I don't know, like taunt the existing world order that is in opposition to United States imperialism and hegemony. I don't know. Is there a particular read that you have on this situation that's different?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is largely it. Like, and there's no denying there's the kind of Marco Rubio faction in the Trump administration that is like, Cuba is their pet project or his pet project of just being like, that's his life calling is to liberate Cuba from its oppressive regime or whatever. So there is that kind of psychopolitics going on too, just the insane personal political pettiness of certain people in the administration. There's the renewal of the Monroe Doctrine, which we talked about in the Venezuela episode. I think that's still at work here. And I think there's a, long-term hope that, like, if you knock over Venezuela and you knock over Cuba, then maybe, that opens up a country like Nicaragua, or kind of disciplines or causes a chill to go over the rest of the continent that makes people afraid of more progressive change. And in some ways that has already happened, right? Like Mexico agreed to not send oil to Cuba. They turned around a tanker that was headed to Cuba to go back to Mexico. And Claudia Sheinbaum, she's like rhetorically trying to like express her sympathy with the Cuban people, but she's not, defying the US. And neither is Canada, by the way. Like, I think sometimes sometimes, it's like easy to pick on a country like Mexico or something like that, but they actually have even more at stake than a country like Canada. And Canada could also, Canada's also a massive fossil fuel producer and could easily defy the blockade if it wanted to as well, and just won't. So, I think like it's a complicated situation where the US is trying to like shore up their hegemony in the region, and definitely in the Americas. One thing I think is kind of interesting, like I've been reading a lot of commentary from the left, but also from liberals trying to work out like what's the 3D chess that Trump is doing here or whatever. If there is such a thing. Trump can't play regular chess. But the kind of, there's one story that's like, yeah, it's trying to force regime change. And maybe that's true. I mean, I guess we'll find out. But there's a even more interesting story to me that suggests it might be more analogous to Venezuela, where like, they got Maduro out, but it's not like they demanded the overthrowing of the PSUV, and it's not like they're demanding elections be held tomorrow, right? Like they found someone they feel is manageable in Delcy Rodriguez. Whether or not that's true, I guess, who knows, but that's how they have spun it. She's like playing ball with them. And there's a lot of speculation around like maybe they're going to try to do the same in Cuba. So maybe you lose Miguel Diaz-Canel, but he's also not Fidel Castro, not Raul Castro, and the party I think is not as like ideologically fragmented as it is in Venezuela. So that also begs the question of whether or not you could really do that. Like, could you really repeat that situation? So, I guess to me, it kind of feels like the simplest explanation is the US is just kind of, I don't know, like throwing its weight around, and it can, because nobody will stop it from doing that. So it's going to. And what the US decides to do next is unclear. But I do think that like it's probably unlikely that the US wants to trigger societal collapse such that there's like thousands of Cubans trying to make their way to the United States, even as the United States is like deporting people in the thousands, including back to Cuba. So, like they're creating a set of contradictions for themselves that I think they don't want also. So we'll see. I don't know. But at the very least, I do think that just the simplest explanation is probably the right one, that the US is, insane and fascist and trying to impose its insane fascism on the rest of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's all true. That makes sense. A helpful read, as always, Dean. The thing that I guess I was thinking about a lot through this whole situation is how that fascism is really bound up in fossil fuels, and that is like a key to the fascism. There's in the monthly review, a bit of socialist literature that we do love on this podcast. This month, I guess it's not this month. It was actually from January. There is an article called "The Shale Revolution: U.S. Energy Imperialism and Mexico's Dependence" by Mateo Crosa. The article's not very long. It's maybe like 6 or 7 pages, but it's basically about political economy of natural gas from the United States to Mexico. And he just describes the ways that, Mexico is their economy is entirely dependent on United States natural gas. And you can see how that plays out in this situation, right? When you are dependent on another country, you can't cross them in this case, where, you would maybe send oil to Cuba if you were Mexico. Now they absolutely, won't for fear of reprisal from the United States. It's just, I don't know. You can't look at the situation without thinking about the ways that energy independence is incredibly important to countries, especially in this new global order that may or may not exist depending on who you talk to. I don't know. Mark Carney has some ideas about this one, I guess, for sure. But anyways, yeah, it just makes you think a lot about the ways that fossil fuels and the overreach of the United States are kind of hand in hand at this very moment, and that's bad. And that's bad what I'm here to say. I have one big point about that, and it's not good.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too, because I think this is raising questions around, Cuba's own energy sovereignty and how does it achieve sovereignty? Because right now, the big problem is Cuba cannot receive fossil fuel specifically, from external countries. And it does produce electricity internally. I think Miguel Diaz-Canel in a speech said, I forget the exact number, but it was between like 30 and 40% of its electricity can be produced domestically. And produced from a variety of sources, including fossil fuels, but renewables as well. And it's funny because when I was in Cuba last, I was there with a Solidarity delegation with some other folks. And one person was kind of remarking, like we were driving by this big smokestack that was just like spewing out, like whatever, yucky smoke. And they were like, oh man, isn't that kind of depressing that like even in Cuba that there's this like reliance on fossil fuels? And it was funny because I was like, well, it's actually really encouraging to see emissions in Cuba, even though that sounds crazy to say, because it signals that the country is like producing and, they're like under these particular conditions and, all this kind of stuff. Lots to say about that. But one thing that is really fascinating is Cuba is actively trying to diversify its grid, in particular with the help of China. And in the last couple of years, I mean, there have been like millions of solar panels installed across the island. Maybe not millions, definitely thousands, millions in aspiration. But hundreds of thousands at least installed. I can't remember the exact number, but it's been rapid in just the last couple of years. And I think Cuba sees the writing on the wall that like energy sovereignty also entails not being dependent on fossil fuels, because that's not only for climate change reasons, but also for like your own sovereignty reasons. You can't really rely on that like network of energy at this stage in a way that maybe you could. So that's quite fascinating. Miguel Diaz-Canel also said they were going to step up their production of solar panels, and that had already been the plan with the help of China. So, like, I think the unfortunate thing is Cuba has already been moving in that direction, but they've been stalled now, and you need the fossil fuels to kind of get you, to the next stage of all of that. And this is exactly the right time for the U.S. to cut them off, because it's pulling all that progress back. So all that to say, like, it is really interesting to be like, renewable energy is in fact a new, like, I mean, for countries that can do it, and in the global South, many of them can. It's like a new front for asserting your own national sovereignty, like being able to get out of the oil kind of grid that the United States effectively like controls at this point in large part. I mean, with the exception of like OPEC and stuff, but the US has like a very specific hegemonic relationship to like fossil fuel trade that is pretty bad.
Yeah, totally. I've been reading this other book this week that has been pretty interesting. It's called Revolution: A Short, Sharp History of Scottish Wind Power. And well, Scotland's an extremely different context, but you can imagine how, exactly what you're saying about energy sovereignty and national identity go hand in hand, especially in a place like Scotland, where energy sovereignty um, is a very popular idea, especially amongst people who are, Scottish nationalists and things like that. So, anyways, interesting the ways that, political economy, as it turns out, is about politics and it's about economics all at the same time, as you might expect. But yeah, I don't know. It just seems like, in a world where the United States is throwing its weight around an awful lot, I would guess that a lot more countries will start thinking very seriously about renewables, not just because of climate change, though that is enough for me, but probably because of the dependency on a country that, maybe they don't like so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, getting toward the end here, I guess the inevitable question is like, this is already bad. What are you supposed to do about that? I think that it is very bad. It's a depressing moment in global history. I myself have found myself genuinely depressed about it. It's not good. And I think that it is a test of like folks of goodwill and people who are politically engaged of like whether or not they'll kind of stand up for Cuba in this specific moment. I mean, the Trump strategy is to be like, there's a lot going on, so they're trying to get you to, either be so overwhelmed with one specific, extremely bad, obviously evil thing, like, ICE basically like occupying a whole city, that you then don't have the capacity to think about anything else, or vice versa. You're like, you don't live in Minnesota, you live somewhere else, maybe not in the US at all, but you're kind of under a constant barrage of like information about bad news. And so then you're kind of paralyzed from doing anything. And I think that the means of resisting that is actually to like try to do a little bit on everything at once, which can also feel exhausting, but is a bit empowering. Like, I think that there's a sense of scale that's important where, like, for example, even something as simple as like taking your lunch hour and like writing one paragraph to your political representative, whether you're in the US or in Canada or some other country, to be like, I don't support this and I want to understand how our government, how you, my representative, are going to, I don't know, do something about it. Like, that takes maybe 20 minutes and is extremely important. I think those kinds of like small gestures are very helpful. There's lots of mutual aid fundraisers going on right now. I know there's the Let Cuba Live fundraiser. They're like gathering funds for solar panels right now to Cuba. There's like a aid flotilla that's going to go in the spirit of the Gaza flotilla to Cuba and try to kind of break that line. So, there's like lots of little efforts. And I think that for especially Christians on the left, there's a long history of Christian solidarity with Cuba. And I think it's important to also kind of check in with your own denomination, figure out what they're doing. In the US, just like, I don't know, maybe a week or 2 weeks ago, maybe more, there was like, I don't know, 10 or 20 Christian organizations of different denominations, some Catholics, some Protestants, whatever. They all kind of had some suggested messaging to go to representatives. So I guess all I'm saying is like, short of like, I don't know, some miracle happening and the Trump administration changing course, obviously like individual action is not going to solve that problem. But I do think like part of being a Christian is having that like faith of a mustard seed bit when it comes to politics, of being like, I don't know, every little bit counts. And with Cuba especially, I think now's the time to make that little bit count a little bit more. So I don't know. That's my like desperate plea to people listening to this podcast, is like, turn this off. You just spent a whole hour listening to a podcast, so turn it off. And I don't know. I give you permission to not listen to the first 20 minutes of our next podcast, and then you can use that time to write your letter to your MP or representative or whatever. But just get out there and be like, this is what I think, and I want somebody to at least like know that. It's got to be on the record somewhere.
Okay, Dean's giving you permission to not listen to the next 20 minutes of the next podcast, but I am not giving you that same permission. So I'm saying you should do all those same things. Write your electeds. Look up the Cuba Solidarity organizations in the country that you live in. Look for the Pastors for Peace or whatever in the U.S. and others. But you do also have to listen to our podcast the next 20 minutes, or else I'll be very mad. So you don't want that kind of thing on your conscience. Me being mad at you, I don't think you can handle that.
Okay,
I'm really bringing that. No, I'm bringing the jock energy though. I'm gonna give you a wedgie for sure. You big nerd. Listen to our podcast.
That's right. You'll be mad if they don't listen to the podcast. I'll be mad if they don't write to their representative. So I think those are the two kinds of anger that you yourself could avoid by the next time we have an episode.
That's right. That sounds good. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/themagnificast. If you support us at $1 or more, you get an invite to our Behind the Paywall Discord, where we have been talking about Steve Bannon's plan to oust the Pope. Stupid, dumb stuff. I hate this. Anyways, there are other cool people in there, though, that you can connect with and talk with, and I don't know. They're all nice people, and that's great. If you need nice people in your life, I know a Discord where you can get to them, and you can get there for $1 or more a month. Isn't that nice? Our intro music is by Amari Armstrong. The outro music is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't want to get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church.